So we hit that for David. We hopefully don't lose the recording. We go here. Okay, so like I said, we're looking at the executive branch, and I don't want to look at it that way. Good. We're looking at the executive branch, and what I'm trying to lay out in the first slide is, what exactly are we looking at? When you think of the executive branch, both historically and in the contemporary sense, it was one of the most feared branches. It's rather analogous to the king and the model that we broke from. So we have some concerns with it. Initially, the intent was to create a rather limited executive branch. But what we see over time is historically this office has evolved. It's expanded in terms of its power. So what we're going to look at largely is, the historic intent and then the expansion of that power. When we look at the expansion of power, we can kind of look at it on paper. We can look at the idea of, okay, here are the powers laid out formally in terms of these constitutional powers. But what happens is expansion occurs because of use. So we're going to look at what I talk about as functional roles of the president. There are functions, there are specific expectations surrounding the president, and in some ways that both enhances and constrains the executive. If you have an expectation of somebody, you tend to give them license to do things in that area. But, if they don't succeed, if they don't achieve what you expect, you're going to have negative evaluation, right? So we're going to look at all kinds of functional roles. We expect, for example, the president to be commander-in-chief. And we tend to defer to the president in terms of, military decisions. Congress allows the president to often act unilaterally. We tend to rally behind the president when there is conflict and troops that are put in harm's way. But if that conflict doesn't go well, then everybody kind of quickly, looks to blame and looks to criticize the president. So there's a number of these functional roles. There's, manager of the economy. We expect the president to have a role in the legislative branch. Chief diplomat, on and on it goes. There's a bunch of hats that the president wears. And again, those functional roles are kind of within the Constitution, but they've also been a product of evolution. As presidents actually, sit in office and take action, that's what has developed over time, all right? The other thing I'm going to show you guys is it's easy to kind of fall into the trap when talking about the executive branch and just focus on the president. We will continually talk about the executive branch, and I will say over and over again that everything that the executive branch does, or the reason why it succeeds and fails or is different, has to do with numbers. There's a single individual that sits atop the executive branch. So I'll keep talking about the singular nature of the executive branch. And in that ways, I kind of maybe mislead you a little bit. Because when you look at this, what you're seeing here is a flow chart of the executive branch. You're seeing, yes, there is the president there in the center of the hub, but they are surrounded by a series of offices and departments and agencies and advisors. And this doesn't even get into the smaller levels where you could see all kinds of positions and titles and other things. That there's thousands that make up the executive branch. So kind of keep this in mind, that there is this complex support staff that exists with the president. And again, that will enhance and confine. Your vacation assignment was to look at that bureaucracy. And a lot of those bureaucratic departments are executive departments. And hopefully one of the things that you guys picked up is, well, we have a bureaucracy because that's a division of labor. People begin to specialize. With specialization, you get expertise. You get better at something. But what you also begin to do is that expertise leads you to say, well, there is a particular way you need to do things. You develop and tattoo this phrase in your head: procedures and protocols, specific ways that you have to do things. Well, those are hoops now. So this support staff gives the president expertise. On the other hand, though, it often can be a kind of a bureaucratic series of hoops. They have these procedures and protocols that slow down any kind of thing that the president wants to implement. All right? So we'll look at the support staff. The final thing we'll look at is historic events, how particular, just like we did with federalism, we went through and we looked at particular time periods or particular ways in which the federal government's powers expanded. We're going to do the same thing. We'll look at how particular presidents set a precedent, and as a result, presidential power expanded. An easy example is Jackson's use of the veto. And all of a sudden it, while it had existed all the time, began to be used kind of on a regular basis by future presidents. All right? So again, what are we looking at? We're looking at the presidency and its historic intent and its modern kind of reality. And part of that story involves expansion through, what you see here in red, expansion through the use of constitutional powers, additional kind of functional roles we assign to the president, a growing support staff, and actual kind of precedents set by the president. Part of the analysis, apologies to David for everything jumping all around there, is looking also at the appropriateness of that expansion. One of the things that I'm going to try to set up is the idea of whether or not we set up presidents for failure. Whether anybody can do this job well, because as presidential power did expand, so did our expectations. And again, based on that singular nature of the figure that sits atop the executive branch, there's the bullseye, there's the target. So anytime anything goes right, arguably, credit gets assigned to the president, maybe sometimes more so than they deserve. But certainly when anything goes wrong, and I mean anything, we assign that to the president. And given the complexity of government and the complexity of achieving reform, achieving anything, you wonder if that is, if any president can succeed in the office. You imagine, you pick your reform and then you try to picture getting it through not only Congress, but the bureaucracy as it implements. And, throw in federalism there and the idea that you have states as implementers. And then you can kind of see what I'm talking about. We also want to look at the implications of, with the expanding nature of the executive branch, what does that do to our balance of power? You've got the three branches, you've got the historic intent. What has it done to our democratic system as the executive branch expands? Okay, so the final thing we'll do is not only just look at the kind of the black and white, do we set up presidents for failure based on our expectations, but I also want to look at strategies that presidents have used, personality types that characterize presidents that have made them more successful. We'll look at a broader definition of presidential success. What's fun in that section is you get to pretend to be a strategist, and you're trying to set your president up for, let's say, a second term. What's going to gain them the kind of the popularity and positive evaluations that will allow them to do that. So you can kind of think of it that way. Okay? So where we start, again, if we're looking at presidential power and historic intent and then modern expansion, well, we got to start with the historic intent, right? And again, what I set up in the beginning was we had tremendous concern and fear surrounding this position in particular. I had mentioned that it's analogous to a king. Well, also what we had as a model was looking at the governors that were in charge of the 13 colonies. And by the time of the Revolution, they had all been converted to royal charters. So what you had were governors that were appointed by the king. They were aristocrats. They were acting in the king's interest. and they were typically pitted against elected assemblies. So we not only have the king as a model, we have these royal governors, and in both cases, you know, the framers, the founders were probably rightly concerned about that position. On the other hand, when you look at the articles, what you see is, with no executive, abject failure, an inability to meet common interest, an inability to even defend the nation against an uprising of farmers and Shays' rebellion, right? So what happens is we know that we need an executive, and we'll debate, you know, as to how many executives initially. Remember, in the New Jersey plan, there was discussion of 2. If you go back to, you know, France and its model, remember they had 5 directors at some point. So there is, it's not an assumption that you would, you know, necessarily have one. You know, there was talk of having a council as well to restrain the president. Again, if you remember when we looked at the Constitutional Convention, hands down, Washington's going to be the president. It's, you know, kind of something that everybody has great confidence in, and they have great confidence that Washington is reputable and capable and not going to abuse his power. He's turned it over so many times. You know, he, you know, accepts responsibility, but he often does it, you know, I would say, you know, not grudgingly, but with resignation. You know, he wants to be that farmer, gentleman farmer. He wants to be in Mount Vernon. He gets drawn into these events out of responsibility. He talks about the day he assumed the presidency as one of his darkest days ever, and he felt like he would never be happy again. All right. So you see him, you know, grudgingly accept leadership in the, not grudgingly, reluctantly accepting leadership in the leading the Continental Congress Army against the British. And when that war concludes, he holds the army together for 2 years while they negotiate a treaty. But then he hands off, you know, his sword over. He is an individual we're going to be comfortable handing power to because he's comfortable handing it back. And we'll see that when he establishes his 2-term tradition as well. That trust will be well placed. Federalist 70 hasn't been written yet, but you know the arguments in Federalist 70, and those were in existence and being circulated. The whole idea of, you know, why do we need a single executive? Well, you know, the nature of the branch demands execution. They're there to carry out or administer law that has been democratically debated. If it's been democratically debated, then there is no longer a need to, you know, have multiple executives that continue to slow the pathway to that law's implementation. That check is unnecessary. And often if it's a disaster relief or response to some sort of military crisis, we want, you know, swift and accountable action with no quarreling. All right, so we need decisiveness. We need, you know, an immediacy, a kind of an expediency, and we need accountability. And they knew that. They'll later formalize those arguments in Federalist 70, but they knew that. All right. So with the idea of one executive, what we want to do is, again, just remind you, this is, you know, hopefully review, hopefully things that we're just trying to cement as opposed to, you know, introduce new concepts. But we look at the Constitution, we look at what are the formal qualifications. And what I noticed with you guys in the congressional, you know, the test on the legislative branch, is we mixed a little citizenship and residency. You know, the idea of citizenship is a formal status conferred upon you by, you know, the state, by the government within the state, that gives you both rights and responsibilities. It gives you a legal status and standing. And different places have different pathways to citizenship. We're kind of unique in that, well, let me ask you guys, what are the kind of the 2 ways that you can become a citizen? There's 3 actually, but let's look at the idea of, you know, the easiest kind of pathways, this natural born. Yeah, if your parents are citizens, you become a citizen, and that includes if you were born elsewhere. You know, let's say they are in the military, or they're in some sort of foreign service, right? You're born elsewhere, but your parents are U.S. citizens. You're a citizen. So nothing that you have to do to kind of earn that right. It's by birth. What's another way? This is where it fuels some of the arguments over immigration.
If you're born in the U.S.
If you're born in the U.S., if you simply, the act of being born on U.S. soil gives you an immediate status and all of its protections. That's fairly unique to the United States. That, hey, you were born on our soil, you are immediately kind of blessed with all of the protections and the democratic rights that are unique to our nation. We wouldn't be a democracy, I suppose, and one that has these rights if we didn't see it that way. Now, the third way is, how would you become a citizen?
You take the citizenship.
Yeah, you'd have to go through the process of immigrating, going through all the kind of the checks and that. It's a lengthy and expensive process, and eventually you take a citizenship test, and you'd get it kind of formally. Well, based on those three ways, you now kind of hopefully understand what it means to be a natural-born citizen. Essentially, what this excludes is that person that immigrated, that came to the U.S. From a different country. The reason for this status is arguably that the person that's born here or born to U.S. parents is the most loyal, is the one that is got the most appreciation for U.S. rights and responsibilities. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting argument because if you gave, I think it's 90 to 95% of people that have immigrated here and taken the citizenship test pass. If you give it to high school students, I think it's around a 30 to 40% pass rate. One of the things about being an American, I suppose, is being able to ignore rights and responsibilities. To say I'm American, I don't have to do anything, including be aware. So it is a kind of an interesting thing that the intent is to pick the person that is the most loyal, the most kind of American. But on some level, we take a lot of things for granted, so this may not be as meaningful as they thought. 35 years is picked. Why? Think like the Federalist Papers. Why is 35 good? Because it's not. What is it not?
25 or 30.
25 or 30, right? With each, the House, we want it to be as democratic as possible. We want it to be as open as possible. That's the most democratic body, 25. The Senate, there's 100 of them. They have arguably, therefore, more power. We want to be a little more exclusive. We want to be a little more careful. The argument is with age comes wisdom and experience. You can argue with that, but that's the kind of the argument. Therefore, with this more even select and dangerous position, we're going to bump it up another 5 years. So 35 years old. Again, life expectancy was a little different back then, but if we look at kind of informally who we elect, we tend to go fairly old. There have been some instances of young presidents, but I guess one of the things I'll point out is, this simply sets a minimum. There obviously, when we begin to vote, we're going to set up some informal qualifications, and we'll really decide what's too old and what's too young. And we tend to kind of think about, I think we still value that idea of with age comes experience and wisdom. We tend to be kind of biased towards, people that have served and, been in a number of positions and have tend to be older. We tend to shy away from someone who's really young. But we also have a barrier against getting too old, obviously, given the demands of the office. The final requirement is residency. Now, again, residency, when it was a state, was simply being able to meet the state's requirement for residency. Often that was simply having property, a mailing address. When we talk about residency here, what we're really talking about is individuals who, obviously in the process of gaining all of this experience, may have been in the military, may have been in foreign service, may have been serving as a diplomat elsewhere, and consequently may have been out of the country more often than in the country. And what we were looking for is to make sure that this person who was a natural born citizen spent enough time to develop that loyalty and that knowledge so that they could serve their nation. So we want to make sure that, and it doesn't even say consecutive, does it? They just have to have, been a resident within the United States for 14 years. So that's it. Now, arguably, could you be a high school dropout and still, become president? Could you be someone with a criminal record and still become president? Could you be somebody who is a member of a number of hate groups and still become president? There's nothing here that excludes, no political identification, no educational, kind of background. There's, as long as you hit these three markers, there's nothing else that would exclude you except for, like, as I had suggested, our informal qualifications. I suppose the framers didn't have to worry too much because they knew that, their intent is with the Electoral College. You would elect electors, but they, in turn, those electors, would be considering all the other variables, all the other things that they thought were important. Because the position is elected, historically by them and then today by you, we can bring in every other little formal qualification that has to be there. What it often shows us, though, is our predispositions. If you look at the wall back there, the string of presidents, they're white, right up to, President Barack Obama. We finally broke that barrier. They're male. We've had several candidates that have been female in recent times. Again, with Hillary Clinton, if you look at the electoral map, she stands a strong chance. That might break that trend, but those would be one out of the 40 plus that are up there. Protestant tends to be kind of the main background. Kennedy is a Catholic. That was it may seem insignificant to you, but it was significant at the time. That was a lot of discussion about his Catholic background and what does that mean, and should a Catholic, can a Catholic govern and not be beholden to the Pope, right? Wealthy. I don't think we've broken that one. They all tend to be incredibly wealthy, and a lot of times they use that wealth, that personal wealth, in running for election. We talked about elections now topping $2 billion, for the presidency. College educated. I said you could be a high school dropout, but I don't have an example of one serving as president. We tend to look for, obviously someone with advanced degrees. Married is typical of all of them. We've got a handful of exceptions in that Buchanan was a bachelor president. Reagan was divorced. That was, you tended to have that nuclear family that you held up, and, the wife, was the, showed her support for the husband, and kids revolved around the husband, and it was all this kind of, typical nuclear family. That still tends to be the trend that, we'll talk about the president as an iconic image, and they can often use that, the fact that that their image is very powerful. They use that as a tool. They use that to kind of cultivate support. One of the ways that they, use that iconic kind of status is to often also surround themselves with family and generate goodwill and good feelings, and they can often use that as political leverage, all right? So a final trend tends to be in the military. We know obviously that they're going to be commander-in-chief. They're going to lead the armed forces. So often what we feel like is, even though a civilian, and deliberately so, is leading the military, it's different than other countries, right? The president is, by definition, a civilian that we have elected to lead the executive branch. They sit atop the military as commander-in-chief, but they are separate. Typically in any nation, the person that controls the tanks, the guns, the stealth fighters, they are by default empowered. Whoever has the guns has the power. This little separation is deliberate so that, we've got a safeguard. But we tend to want somebody who's going to put troops in harm's way or might face that responsibility to kind of know the job. So historically, it was always, you had to have some military experience. certain examples like Eisenhower stand out, where it was their military experience that largely gave them their popularity. In you know After the 70s, in the 70s, 80s, and even up into the 90s, what war was the litmus test? This kind of could make or break someone's political career, whether or not they served in this. Vietnam, because with Vietnam, it became an unpopular war, and many people with prominent positions and ties might have used those prominent positions to avoid service, whether it was by going in the National Guard or finding some other way to defer service. So that became a litmus test, and now it doesn't seem as relevant. What's happened is we've kind of you have presidents that are of a generation that is no longer a relevant issue, and I don't know. Our thinking seems to have evolved in terms of a requirement on military service. Yeah, I think it still obviously gives a candidate some credentials, but it doesn't seem as central as what it used to be. At any rate, you could probably think of other ones as well to continue to pepper in here. But what I want to do is, again, stress this as a counterbalance, that these are minimum safeguards, but it is often very interesting to look at the demographic trends in terms of who we elect to see our own kind of internal both requirements, safeguards, but at the same time bias. There definitely is some in there, and you wonder if there. I don't know. We talked about with Congress the idea of with more diversity. There's a value to that in that diversity, allows different perspectives. When women began to enter into Congress, spending for women's health issues went up. Males, I'm a father, I have a mother, I have a wife. I'm very concerned with women's issues. I think I think you have to be careful about how you even phrase this. A women's issue is my issue, because if my wife makes more and she has more rights, my family does better. So what's good for her is good for me, right? But I might have blinders, and serving in Congress, I might, not see about ways in which we can kind of improve both women's and everyone's lives as well. So diversity often helps you overcome those blinders. Well, how do you do it in a single branch then? How do you do it with a single individual? How do you bring in that diversity? And should there be anything that kind of mandates it? It's a question I'll pose to you. I certainly won't answer it. Some of our abilities to select obviously is complicated by the Electoral College. So again, we've narrowed it down to a single individual. We've looked at what their minimum qualifications should be, and we just want to refresh your memory about how we elect them. And again, this was a feared institution, therefore we're going to be very careful about selection. Historically, you were not smart enough or capable enough to select the president. You were smart enough and capable enough to recognize someone smarter than you who in turn would elect the president. That system, more formally known as the Electoral College, what you did then and still do today is you essentially cast your vote for a slate of electors who in turn will cast the formal vote for the president, right? So ideally, when you look at it within the first two terms for Washington, it was a body of independent-minded individuals who arguably, had more education, more status, more standing. Arguably, they cast a more informed vote. What changes the mechanism for how this works is political parties, and essentially, it takes that historic intent and throws it out the window. Elections are kind of funny. Again, you are having people from political parties compete for a national office in state-by-state elections. And so all three entities have a say. The Republicans are looking for their nominee. The Democrats are looking for their nominee. As they go through the primaries, the parties are looking for their nominee to get the delegates they needed through state-by-state elections. And then eventually we'll have our general elections, our competition between the two parties for the one person that will serve in the White House, right? So again, that's political parties competing in state-by-state elections for a national office. All three have a say. What happens over time is as political parties develop, they begin to kind of control the delegate process. They are going to be, when you are going in that state-by-state election, you are voting for either the Democrats' delegates or the Republicans' delegates. And again, I have to be careful about this. The candidate or the slate of delegates that gets the most votes gets to send that slate of delegates. Remember, you don't have to necessarily win in a majority if there's multiple candidates. Everybody remember what that term is? Where you just simply get more than the other? There's 3 candidates, let's say. So you win with 35% of the vote. Plurality, right? So I've got it in the notes often as majority, but remember, if it was a multi-race, multi-candidate race, it could simply be a plurality, all right? So at any rate, political parties change this, and they nominate the electors that you are in turn voting for. They are not going to pick wishy-washy individuals. They're not going to pick random people off the street. They pick die-hard individuals that almost 99.9% of the time cast their vote as directed. You occasionally have some rogue electors. I think I told you what they're called. Anybody remember? In case I didn't. Faithless electors. You occasionally have these faithless electors who just can't do it. There were, let's say, there were originally 14 Republican candidates, and one that's really unpalatable gets the nomination, and eventually their state is supposed to, vote for them. And somehow it's more palatable to them to go to the Democrat than the Republican, right? That's the scenario. You're a handful of Republican nominees or Democratic nominees, and one that is so distasteful to them that they're willing to go to the other party. You can see that scenario really probably doesn't happen often at all. It's never happened to a degree where it even moved the needle in terms of an election, okay? But it is there. What I want you guys to understand is that when people are mad at the Electoral College, they're not, and they say my vote doesn't count. It does count. It just has this weird conversion. You are, it wouldn't count if you were voting for an elector who then disregarded your will, your intent. These guys essentially are a rubber stamp. So what we're mad at is often lost within the numbers. It's the conversion factor that often kind of skews things. So let's see if you guys can remember the numbers. When you are looking at the Electoral College, it's a race to get what out of what? How many electoral votes are there total? There's a logic to that number. Paul's close. Go ahead. 538. What's the logic? How did you get there?
It's like Congress plus 3 for
Good.
DC.
Yeah, so I've got to figure out how to represent states. Well, I've already had that argument. I'm going to represent states based on statehood and population. I'm going to look at the number of electors or representatives that they have typically, and I'm going to award them that many electors. So, if California has 54 representatives, they've got 2 senators and, 52 representatives, that's how many delegates they're going to get. So essentially with the same formula I use for Congress is the same formula I'll use for the Electoral College, but we mentioned DC. DC, because it is the nation's capital, and we want at least the illusion of it being politically neutral, doesn't have representatives. And, they have delegates, and typically I guess that's okay, but, the lack of political representation becomes really kind of stark when you consider, well, geez, they don't have any voice in the presidential elections. No, let's give them 3, right? That's how we get to 538. So half of that plus 1 is the elections are a magic race to, if you struggle with the math, what is it? 270. All right? So you got to remember those kind of numbers. Your vote gets skewed in terms of, what it counts as into these numbers. So it either gets, enhanced or minimized, I suppose. What makes it worse is 48 out of the 50 states award their slate of electors on a what? Remember that term? I carry the state with 51% of the vote. I carry the state, there's multiple candidates, I have a plurality. How many of the electors do I get? All of them. Anybody remember what it's called? Where you get to take all. I just gave you half of it. This is all on tape. The stony silence. It's called a winner-take-all system, right? And that's really what skews it, this winner-take-all system. Because what happens is, you know, I can win a state by a narrow margin and then skew the results. You know, I win the election, but I don't have a ton of the popular vote. So let's, you know, in the waning minutes, give you a quick visual. You know, what I can do is win an election by carrying 11 states, the 11 most kind of populous states. And I can win it by a razor-thin margin. And then I can lose in the other states by a landslide. And what it sets up is the possibility of winning this but losing that, or losing this and winning that. What is it possible to do? What two things might not match? I can win this but lose that.
Win the electoral
Yep.
vote,
But lose the popular vote. And that has happened a number of times, all right? So that's one way it skews things. Obviously, it's going to skew where we campaign as well. What kind of states do we go to? More so than others. Not red states, not blue states. Those are already locked up. What are the ones that I'm going to go to? Swing states, right? And remind me, within the swing states, again, you want to kind of look at how what looks red and what looks blue is not exactly red or blue. We're a purple nation, all right? I'll pick up with that tomorrow. We'll say goodbye to David, hopefully.